He's going to break down what stood out to him from an in-game handicapping perspective from a very interesting week one in the NFL. And Eric, like most week ones, we had a fair share of surprises, that's for sure, in terms of individual performances, in terms of final outcomes, in terms of one really catastrophic injury. But I know you were focused mostly on what was happening on a play-to-play basis in these games. And especially in games involving three of the true legacy franchises of the NFL. So let's dive right in. How are you doing, and what's your entry point into week one from an in-game handicapping angle?
Man, you're speaking my language with that entry point. I don't even know if we've used that term yet to this point, but that's the moment you enter into an in-game bet. That's the moment you enter into any bet. Right. But the difference is in in-game, your entry point matters a lot more than it does pre-game. And so entry point is the perfect word because it applies so much more to in-game. And before we get to the Niners and the Dolphins and the Cowboys and how that applies to just some basic in-game stuff that we can look for value, I had to say something on the Monday night game. Obviously, you reference it with the injury. I've never been a big Aaron Rodgers fan, but you hate to see anybody get hurt. I kind of felt, something was not going to work with this. I never imagined it would be an injury. I thought it'd be more of a performance thing. But let's just get right into the in-game value of the Monday night game, and I'll just get through it super quick. We've talked about before negative plays and negative situations are what move the numbers for us to get value in in-game. And that conundrum is something that's so hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. They're like, hey, if something negative has happened, you're telling me to bet on that negativity? But that's normally, not always, but that's normally where the best value can be found. Now, the flip side of that is if somebody's just dominating and the positive energy and the positive things that are happening that are moving the numbers away from us, that can be valuable sometimes too. But this is the perfect example of the former, where a hugely negative occurrence ended up being the best possible value scenario for the New York Jets from an in-game standpoint. So we all know first drive, what was it? Third play, fourth play. I believe it's fourth play of the first drive. Aaron Rodgers gets sacked, injured during the play. Zach Wilson comes in, 2nd and 20. Obviously, Zach Wilson played the rest of the game. Now, from that moment, when Aaron Rodgers got hurt, and I'm going to my screenshots right here, the spread went from 3.5 to 5.5. Not much. Not a big deal at that moment. But when the money started coming in, then it goes up to 6.5. And we can see the floodgates opening if you're watching the in-game screen that, okay, obviously the public money is going to come in on Buffalo. What I wanted to point out is the reason why this was such a valuable movement of the number based on something extremely negative, but it actually created positive value for in-game handicappers, is the fact that it shifted the philosophy, and it's something we're going to talk about later, philosophy, in the next segment, but it shifted the philosophy drastically for the Buffalo Bills. Not for the Jets. Everybody think, well, Aaron Rodgers just went out. It's going to shift the philosophy of the Jets. Well, it only changed one thing for the Jets, and that was the play calling for the quarterback. But for the Bills, it changed their entire philosophy, and I'm going to tell you why. Immediately following that drive, after the Jets punted, the Bills go on an 11-play, 55-yard drive, hold the ball for almost 6 minutes, and that drive culminates 4th and 2 at the Jets 22. 4th and 2 for the Bills at the New York Jets 22. If Aaron Rodgers never gets hurt, the Buffalo Bills go for that 4th down. They go for it 4th and 2, no hesitation, at the New York Jets 22. But because Rodgers is hurt and Zach Wilson looked like Zach Wilson on that first drive, Sean McDermott is thinking, we don't need to score 1 million points to win this game. Our defense can hold up against Zach Wilson. Let's just get some sure points here. They changed their philosophy going into the game of being aggressive. They completely shifted to a conservative mindset. And as soon as they lined up to kick that Tyler Bass field goal and it went in and it's 3-0, I knew at that point there's going to be some value on the Jets. So before I go any further, I just want to get your thoughts on where we are right now, Wanda. You can kind of look at it to see if I missed anything of describing the value up to this point.
No, absolutely. I think, that is another great example of what we talked about already a couple of times before, which is kind of having to think a couple of layers deeper sometimes as an in-game handicapper than just what you're seeing on the screen. In fact, it's almost mandatory that you think a couple of layers deeper as a default, I think, usually in those cases, because we know that the books and the way the lines are being set, even on an in-game basis, are based on what the majority of people's immediate reactions or surface reactions are going to be to what they're seeing in front of them. So I think that's another great example of, you just have to kind of do a lot of if-then thinking in your mind and kind of see what the domino effect is of things like this when they happen. Something as major as Rodgers' injury, when those things kind of happen, you have to kind of really give it a little bit of thought and play it out in your mind as to how the other team is thinking about it as well.
100%. They always say to catch a fish, you got to think like a fish. You want to catch a coach, you got to think like a coach.
Yeah.
And this is what I've always said, that, we always handicap the game and we handicap players for props, but we got to handicap coaches as well. And this particular example here is what I've always called situational handicapping. Just like Bill Belichick has always preached situational football. And we might have talked about that on an earlier episode, but this is a perfect example of situational handicapping. So at the moment that philosophy shifted for Buffalo to say, oh, we're taking this 39-yard field goal here rather than going for it on 4th and 2 with a workhorse, a stud like Josh Allen that can pick up 2 yards in his sleep, and they kick the field goal. It's almost like the sports books caught up to what was happening, even though everything for their end games, most of these in-game numbers are generated by algorithms that are monitored by human beings, but the numbers are still generated by algorithms. But the number posted after that field goal was successful. 3-0, a minute 33 left in the first quarter. It's 3-0. I guess at that point it was just a little bit before, probably like closer to 2 minutes left in the first quarter. It's 3-0 Bills. And the spread is still 6.5. So they hadn't crossed over that magic number, that magic pregame number of 7. The books at that point with 2 minutes left in the first quarter, possibly because of that shift in philosophy, even if they're not calling it that, but something might have been recognized by someone or something that, hey, this isn't going to be the bloodbath that a lot of people think it's going to be, at least not at this point. Buffalo's playing it close to the vest. So the books, even though they understand they're going to get a lot of Buffalo money, they still kept the spread below 7 at -6.5. However, when Buffalo finally did score their first touchdown, which was 2 drives after their field goal drive, there was an interception in between. We know there was plenty of interceptions for Josh Allen in this game. But the next scoring drive for them was an 11-play, 75-yard, almost 6-minute drive. That made it 10-3 for the Bills. And at that point, the spread went up to -10.5 for Buffalo. So now the books have to understand this may get out of hand. Now that they've been in the end zone, and it's not just a field goal situation, this could get out of hand. We're going to get a lot of Buffalo money, so we need to make this number as high as we can. They make it -10.5 for the Bills. If you want to take the Jets plus 10.5, FanDuel had the juice at -125. But as we progress to get to the floor and ceiling, and I'll wrap this up, when it was 13-3, we saw the biggest version of this number the entire game, -13.5 for Buffalo at 13-3, just before halftime. Buffalo kicks that field goal. It's 13.5 on the spread. But if you want to take the Jets, they're going to charge you -120. So they're still understanding that the Buffalo money's coming in. But if any sharps or anybody that wants to take back some Jets value, it's going to cost you $1.20. That's cool. That was the ceiling number was 13.5. Now, the floor that we're going to see come down here all the way to the very end to close it out, once that third interception kicked in, once it got to the point, and remember, there was a fourth turnover towards the end of this game. There was a fumble for Buffalo. But after the third interception, when the Jets followed with a touchdown to tie this game up, going into that touchdown drive for the Jets, the low point of the spread before that score was 6.5 going into that drive. There was 9 minutes, 43 seconds left in the fourth quarter, plus 6.5. At the end of that drive, when they tied it up, it was down to plus 3.5. And the reason why this is so valuable is because I was willing to take the Jets. From the moment Rodgers went down, I was waiting for something to shift, something to be shown that would be earth-shattering, not beyond the injury. And the earth-shattering thing to me was the way that McDermott clammed up and decided to settle for the field goal. From that moment on, I said, I'm willing to take the Jets at 6.5 or more for the rest of this game until something changes. I liked them at 10.5. I liked them at 13.5. And going into this scoring drive that tied the game at 13, I liked them all the way to plus 3.5. And that's where I cut it off, because they did even at one point get to a pick 'em after the Buffalo fumble, after the game-tying drive for the Jets. The ensuing drive for Buffalo was a fumble, and that's when the game went down to basically a pick 'em. Right. And the reason why I looked at that and said I don't want the Jets anything beyond plus 3.5 is because overtime was still in play. And we did go into overtime when a lot of people thought the Bills would win it on that final drive when they had 2 minutes on the clock, and they ended up settling for a field goal. I believe there was a late penalty. But the bottom line is this. I didn't want to get stuck with the Jets having to win the game, especially with overtime as a high possibility. I cut off my value for the Jets at plus 3.5. Anything below 3.5 means that they're going to have to win the game outright. And I did not want to be in that position. Now, they ended up winning the game outright anyway, and that's fine. But I want to let everybody know that even though I saw value with the Jets basically the entire time from the moment the Bills changed their philosophy and kicked that field goal, you still don't want to get crazy. I mean, at one point, the money line for the Jets, when the spread was like 13.5, the money line was up to plus 700, plus 800. We've talked about that before. You don't want to go crazy in those situations just because you see value in the underdog. You still take the points. And in this case, I capped off the value at plus 3.5. And this might be one of the best situational handicapping examples of the entire season. And I'm glad it happened in week 1 so we could get it out and share it with y'all.
That's excellent. No, Eric, thanks for being on top of that, because it was such a prominent game to begin with. So it's a great one to use as an example. Also, because many people listening obviously were tuned into that, saw all of what you just described unfold as far as the events on the field. And of course, you're always keeping a close eye on what the books are doing. And so that's where you come in with kind of tying the two things together. And that's a perfect example. And like you said, you still exercise a bit of caution. That plus 700 or whatever it was, as you were mentioning, must have been mighty tempting, as we talked about, I think, a couple episodes ago. And yet you had your standards that you stuck to, and you've explained that before. I mean, you have to have the discipline also as an in-gamer in so many different ways and so many different facets, from not placing a bet at all to limiting what you are willing to place to everything in between. So I'm sure with this nice long season ahead of us, we're going to have a ton of examples in which that'll come up, and the importance of that'll be kind of illustrated. So, and I think you've got three interesting ones I know that you want to dive into today. So let's get right into it. Whichever one you want to start with first of those three teams we talked about before.
Sure. You know what? This is all lumped together with the 49ers and their W, the Dolphins and the Cowboys and their respective W's. This all ties in to three things that I try to line up as an in-game handicapper from a football standpoint, college or pro, is pace, philosophy, and physicality. Now, philosophy being either from the coordinator side or the head coaching side, or both. But can I give a positive or negative grade to any of these three things throughout the in-game handicapping process from game to game? And when I start to find a team that gets a positive grade on 2 out of the 3 and is flirting with a perfect 3 out of 3 score where all 3 are lining up positive, regardless of what point we're at in the game, the earlier the better. But when I can see a positive pace, in this case, positive for what I look for is the faster the better. And as long as, I mean, if an offense is playing with its hair on fire, as long as they can handle it and they're not having a bunch of false starts and fumbles and kind of like what we saw from Nebraska against Colorado on Saturday, where they just losing their minds with simple things like, ball transfers and security, handoffs and snaps, all that kind of stuff. If a team can handle positive pace, meaning the faster the better, and they can handle it, that's something that's very positive to me as an in-game handicapper. Philosophy. When I say a positive grade on philosophy, what I'm looking for is, do I agree with the philosophy that a particular coach or coordinator is trying to execute? And if I agree with it, are they successfully executing it? I don't really care if a team is executing a philosophy that I don't agree with, because if I don't agree with it, I don't want to touch it on their side, and I might even want to bet against it. But if I'm going to bet for somebody, I want to make sure that they're not just being successful at what they're doing. I want to make sure they're being successful at something I agree with. So finally is physicality. We talked about pace, philosophy. The last thing we're trying to grade, positive or negative, is physicality. And the perfect example of this, I think, will start with the Cowboys in the late game on Sunday. And the reason why physicality is something probably one of the most important of the three over the course of a whole game, when you're talking about pace, philosophy, and physicality being graded throughout an in-game handicapping process, is physicality is not something that can be changed or reversed at halftime or re-schemed against at halftime. It's not like everybody's going to go into the quarter break or go into the halftime locker room and automatically come out more physical. Hey, guys, we need to get stronger. We need to get tougher. It's not a scheme thing. It can be connected to mentality, obviously, but the most important thing is the will that goes with positive graded physicality. If you see it on multiple drives early in a game, you can pretty much look as far as you possibly can down the rest of the pathway of that game to say, how is this going to change? And the Cowboys were the perfect example. The way that they came out and dominated early, and they didn't need to score on the turnovers that they were creating. They didn't even need to turn the ball over. Now they did. I'm going to go to the play-by-play screen right now for this game. But they didn't just exercise substantial dominance in the physicality department, but they turned it into turnovers and turned it into points. And so why is this valuable to in-game handicapping? Most of this seems pretty obvious, right? Well, if you watch this game from the beginning, the Giants were rolling. They had an 11-play drive for almost 7 minutes before that field goal was blocked. That led to the opening score of this game, the touchdown to make it. I forgot that they had missed the extra point, or you know what? It's not really even important because I'm not even focusing on that right now. But it was 6-0. So when it was 6-0 at that juncture, the most important. Okay, PAT failed because I'm still getting used to Brandon Aubrey as the Cowboys kicker. That's why it was a little trouble with me to try to find that. But the bottom line is this: the Giants were rolling, and I really think the only reason why they were rolling is because the Cowboys were getting settled in. Micah Parsons and everybody they have like gangbusters. to dominate the line of scrimmage from a defensive standpoint. And then obviously with Diggs and everybody in the secondary, they were still getting settled in. And the Giants were 1st and 10 at the Dallas 16. And that was from a Daniel Jones scramble of 11 yards to get them down to the Dallas 16, 1st and 10. And what I really think they recognized right there, Dallas understood, okay, they're doing the same stuff the Giants did last year, all the smoke and mirror stuff. They're not going to let Daniel Jones be a quarterback. Maybe he can't be a real quarterback. He's going to be a smoke and mirrors kind of guy. He's going to run some. He's going to hand off. He's going to throw screens, but he's not going to be a traditional quarterback. I think that the Cowboys decided, if we put that in the back of our minds and understand that this guy's not going to beat us downfield, let's focus all our physicality on him in the pocket as a sitting duck, and the only person that's going to beat us is Saquon Barkley. And from that moment, they went from 1st and 10 at the Dallas 16 to 2nd and 10, and they wound up getting a penalty, making it 3rd and 7 at the Dallas 13. And after that, at 3rd and 7,
they had a fumble. Looks like Jones and they had a fumbled exchange, I think, at that point at the 18. Yeah, that let put the ball back 5 yards, and then you had the field goal block.
So yeah, why? And thank you, by the way, because I was getting a little lost here in the handicap.
Yeah, actually, put the ball back 14 yards. So it was a big loss because Jones didn't recover it here until the 27 of the Cowboys when they started that playoff at the 13. So
that's it. And this is basically what I'm getting at is this: the signs of the physical dominance. If we're looking for these three things: pace, philosophy, and physicality. Well, on the opening drive, we saw a little pace from the Giants. There was some positivity there. The philosophy for them was obvious: smoke and mirrors. Like I said, they're not. I don't even think they went to a wide receiver until their 3rd or 4th drive. Right. It was basically just Saquon Barkley, tight ends, and Daniel Jones scrambling. Matter of fact, that opening drive was all Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley,
with the exception of a Matt Breida 6-yard run. It was, it's crazy.
And so that right there in itself, put yourself in the shoes of the Cowboys defense, and I'm blanking on their coordinator, the guy that used to coach the Falcons, and he was the defensive coordinator for the Seahawks for years in the Legion of Boom, Dan Quinn.
Oh yeah, Dan Quinn, yeah.
And so put yourself in his shoes and put yourself in the shoes of Micah Parsons and, everybody running that defense, Vander Esch. They're basically looking and saying, okay, we understand now that this is going to be a one-dimensional offense. Let's punish them for that. If they can't go to 2-dimension or 3-dimension, then let's punish them for it. At that moment, anything that I saw from the Giants that had any value goes right out the window. And now my handicap is completely on the Cowboys. From the physicality standpoint, I'll wait for the pace and the philosophy, which comes in on offense. But just from physicality on defense, I can make a big handicap based on the end of this drive once they recognize, just like when we recognized when McDermott decided to play conservative in the Bills-Jets game.
Yeah,
once I recognize that the Giants were one-dimensional and the Cowboys figured it out, I can look ahead the rest of the game and say, I don't know if the Giants will be in the red zone ever again.
Well, to your point, the very next drive, to your point, because the ball, it's a quick turnaround since it's a blocked field goal return for a touchdown. So New York gets the ball right back in its hands, and 3 plays, negative 10 yards on the next drive, 2 incomplete passes, then a sack for a loss of 10, and they're back to punting. And then, after Dallas rips off a 9-play, 72-yard drive for a field goal, the next drive for New York, 3 plays, -9, in pick 6, and then a punt, three and out, 3 yards, and a punt in the next drive. So, I mean, you basically, like you said, that kind of was the first domino to fall, and everything from there just fell into place.
And that's a great point. Like when you play out the string like that, and we really look to see how quickly things got out of hand. What the most important thing to realize is here, and I will tie in the Niners and the Dolphins just to kind of cap this out, because this is really the main focus on the actual mindset of looking for these three things. We don't need to dive deep in the other two teams I'll just kind of close out with those. But using this as the deep dive for these three things, pace, philosophy, and physicality, physicality being the most important to start with, the biggest thing to remember here is the quicker this gets out of hand on the field, the quicker it gets out of hand on the sportsbook side with the numbers going against us as in-game handicappers. So the earlier we confirm what we're seeing, the earlier we can get our numbers and the more value we can get before the numbers get out of hand. Because the spread for this game, which I believe was right around a field goal pregame, I'm going to double check right now. Yeah, -3 for the Cowboys on the road. After that first touchdown, you know, the algorithms and the people running them, they can't panic too quickly. But they went right around the 5.5, 6.5 range. So that pregame spread almost doubled just by that first drive. And the reason why that's important to remember is because if you're looking to take, obviously we know what happened with this game. You know, 40-0, basically 95% of the spreads for this entire game were in Dallas's favor on the in-game side. But what I want people to get into perspective and the mindset of is, what if the final score of this game wasn't 40-0? What if the final score of this game was 20-10? At some point, you have to self-police to say, man, the Cowboys in this case are dominating like crazy physically, and I don't think the Jets are going to be able to score, the Giants. But even if they do score, it might not be till late in the game, and they might have to go for 2 or 3 4th downs, and this might be really difficult for the Giants to score. So at that point, all that's left is, well, how much are the Cowboys going to score? Nobody knew when it was 7-0 that they were going to put up 40. I mean, technically, they probably could have put up 50 or 60 if they wanted to. You still need to think about getting the best number. So the earlier you can recognize, regardless of when they're recognizing on the field, which is part of your handicap, once you saw the Dallas defense shift and say, okay, we're not playing the pass anymore. We're just going to get after Daniel Jones and stop the run. And if they're going to beat us, it's gonna be with Barkley, or Daniel Jones is going to have to be a quarterback. By the time you get to the next drive, like you said, Juan, when they went 3 and out, Daniel Jones passing complete to Slayton, Daniel Jones passing complete to Waller, and then Daniel Jones sacked at the New York Giants 15 for -10 by Micah Parsons. At that moment, the spread is already up to 9.5 and 10.5 in some places. Now, in this game, you got away with it if you took that. If you took Dallas -9.5, -10.5, you're good. But you want to get into the perspective for a full season that diagnosing long-term physicality and dominance in the physicality department, the earlier the better, which I know is Captain Obvious. But if it gets too far, if the number gets too big against us, not every game is going to be 40-0. So if you decide, I'll close by saying this. If you needed that one extra drive, the one I just described where they went 3 and out and Jones got sacked at the Giants 15, if you needed that drive to go ahead and finally confirm that the Giants aren't going to be able to move the ball. Because we know Daniel Jones he's not just going to become a quarterback in the middle of this game and just all of a sudden, live up to his contract. He's a nice guy, but he's not a quarterback. That was a miracle that he got that money. God bless him. But we know that's not going to happen. And right. So at that point, you're no longer dealing with the Cowboys -6.5 in game. You're dealing with the Cowboys -9.5 or -10.5. And that's fine in a game like this where it literally was, Dallas doing anything they wanted at any point in the game. But once you get past that second confirmation drive, if you need 3 drives to confirm something, you're probably taking a number that's too big at that point. So look for that physical dominance from an explainable standpoint, not just something to say, oh, this team's playing physical, but where there's a science behind it. And in this case, the science was they were playing against a quarterback that can't actually play the position as a thrower, can only play the position as a runner with the occasional throw, and Dallas defense exploited that. Just remember, the sooner you can figure out the truth, the sooner you get your value, the better value you'll get on the in-game number side. And it was the same thing with the Niners and the Dolphins, which I'll finish with. The Niners did the same exact thing that the Cowboys did to the Steelers. I mean, made Kenny Pickett look very similar to Daniel Jones, made the running game look very similar when Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren just struggled that whole game. Not a lot of balls going to wide receivers. The only difference is that the 49ers took their foot off the gas a little bit sooner than the Cowboys did. And on top of that, in that particular game, the Steelers did end up getting in the end zone at some point. And I did want to actually just bring up.
And I think the other thing, I mean, I guess Kyle Shanahan was a little bit more focused, especially early. The games did play out a little bit differently from the other, and I think to your point of what you were saying earlier, I think the perception on the San Francisco side is, hey, Pittsburgh is not an offensive juggernaut by any means, but this is week one. We don't know how much improvement Kenny Pickett's made, but the guy has a pretty decent outlook coming into the season. A lot of improvement expected. This is the second year they're running this offense under this coordinator. They've got some big play explosive guys. I mean, George Pickens is more explosive than anybody the Giants have in their wide receiver core, probably that's healthy at least at this point. I'm going to make an exception for Wan'Dale Robinson right now, who's still not fully healthy. And I know they have a Jalen Hyatt, also a really high upside, very fast rookie. But in terms of, somebody who's already a little bit more proven and it's got the size, got the whole package, Pickens, Freiermuth, all these guys put a little bit more fear into the heart of defensive coordinators. So I think Shanahan, if you look at Purdy's usage in this game and how he was deployed, and he had a lot more of a traditional quarterback role, to the point that you were making about Jones kind of being just a game manager deluxe there. Purdy was used as a real quarterback with downfield throws. Brandon Ayuk was the beneficiary this time, but we know that any other, on any given week, it could be Kittle, it could be Samuel, it could be McCaffrey in the passing game. So I think San Francisco took everything a little bit more, I don't know if seriously is the right word, but they definitely remained, I think, a little bit aggressive for longer, recognizing, as you were saying, that the opponent on the other side is not just completely inept offensively or is not completely without the ability to kind of quick strike. I think that's one of the things maybe the McCarthy and his staff were looking at. They don't see where the quick strike capability is going to come from New York. Even if they do score, it's going to take them a long march down the field, most likely.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's thinking like a coach. To catch a coach, think like a coach.
Right.
That's a great layer to add to this handicap, and that really did unfold that way. Now that you bring that up, is the capability was as anemic as the Steelers were. They definitely had a much higher capability level of being able to at least get back in the game at some point. I mean, they scored before halftime to make it 20-7, but they did have another incredible drive later in the game where it looked like they were going to score, and that was when they turned it over. They turned it over on downs twice in the second half. Plus they had an interception, but there was a couple of points in the second half where it looked like, hey, maybe the Steelers might be able to make this finish at a one-score game. They're probably not going to be able to complete a comeback, but the dominance, the physicality, and the dominance on the physical side, just like with the Cowboys, was the same exact thing with the 49ers. But to your point, it was a much more I don't want to say superior foe, but definitely the Steelers offense is far superior to the Giants offense. It's a lesser of two evils. And then the last but not least, those are the two perfect examples of finding like physical dominance at its best and being able to capture that value as early as possible. Remember, you don't have to capture an in-game spread when you recognize that. You can still play it from a team total standpoint. From the Niners, when I diagnosed 2 Steelers drives into that game, and I diagnosed the physicality of the Niners, which was a 1:00 game, I actually chose to go with the Niners team total over at 26.5, which is ironic because they had 20 points on the board at halftime, but they only put up 10 in the second half. So the over 26.5 was actually the incorrect choice for me, even though it ended up winning.
Right.
But because they won this game by 23, I could have gotten the Niners at about minus 8.5 when it was 10-0, 7-0 around there. I would have been able to have much less of a sweat taking the Niners at minus 8.5, even minus 9.5, rather than having them have to get to 27. Because if you look at it this way, if I have to have them get to 27, that means that even at a 9.5 point spread, that means the Steelers can still get to 17 if I lock in minus 9.5 versus taking over 26.5 for their team total over.
Right.
If the Niners have to get to 27, then I can allow the Steelers to get up to 17. So the spread would have been the better play, but I want to put it out there that you can still look at other options once you recognize this dominance. You're trying to figure out what's the best way to bet it in game. And a lot of times the best way to bet it will be the spread. But other times, if for some reason there is more of a possibility of garbage time scores at the end of a game, just like you said, but the Steelers having more capability than the Giants, maybe partially in the back of my mind, that's why I felt a little more comfortable taking the over 26.5 with the Niners, because I felt that there might be a higher capability that the Steelers put up some garbage points at the end, and they almost did, that might jeopardize my spread with a backdoor cover, or in this case, a backdoor cover for the Steelers, which would be a backdoor loss for me. That wasn't the case. But the Niners and the Cowboys, two incredibly perfect examples of physical dominance. And the earlier you diagnose it, and not just diagnose it with the eye test, but diagnose the why. Why is this happening? And in this case, the examples were almost identical. It was a quarterback problem. Kenny Pickett, I definitely think, has much more upside than Daniel Jones as someday being an actual quarterback, but he's not a quarterback yet, not at this level. And Daniel Jones definitely is not. And because of their limits as passers, the Niners and the Cowboys were able to not only dominate on the defensive side, but get the ball back quicker to their offense, making it even more of a problem for their opponents to ever get back in these games, because they took so much less time to get their scores, where, like you said, if the Giants were to score, the Steelers were to score, it was going to take 12 plays, 13 plays, 14 plays. So we got to see that value with the Niners and the Cowboys. And last but not least, with the Dolphins, it's pretty much a standpoint of a much different type of a game than we saw here. Obviously, this was more with the Dolphins about pace and philosophy. And I wanted to close by saying this. By diagnosing that the Dolphins were purposely playing fast and purposely not running the ball, which is something I don't think that they can get away with the rest of the year. You can't rely on Tua throwing 400 plus and Tyreek Hill losing his mind every game and just expecting to win that way. When you think about the way the Dolphins won this game at the very end, if they had been running the ball maybe 10% more, 15% more, it might not have been such an issue. But what I wanted to get into in this case is they still got a positive grade on philosophy. Even though I didn't agree with it, I wanted them to run more. But their pass-heavy offense worked the entire game. The Chargers couldn't stop it. So they get a positive grade, the Dolphins. They get a positive grade on pace, and they get a positive grade on philosophy. And their physicality.
Yeah.
Go ahead, man.
Sorry to cut you off, Eric. I wanted to mention something while it was on my mind based on what you were saying there, too. I'm remembering you speaking about McDaniel and using him as an example of a fourth down aggression during the preseason when we went over that preseason game against the Falcons, I believe it was. And this this general approach he took in this game against the Chargers in Week 1 was very interesting. You gave the warning out, or basically you gave out the kind of sounded the alarm that, even though it's preseason, there's definitely value in observing how coaches are calling plays in the preseason, what kind of approaches they're taking. And sure enough, come Week 1, when the games start to count, McDaniel, to his credit, doesn't back down. And in this case, I'm not referring necessarily just to fourth downs, but I'm talking about more so the way he approached this matchup. If you looked at it on paper, from based on last year, and I think based on the last couple years, without looking at the numbers directly, but definitely the Chargers a lot easier to run on than they are to pass against. In fact, last year, I know for a fact they were one of the toughest teams on a yards per game allowed basis to pass on in the league. You just didn't want to do it. And in fact, when they went up there or out there, Miami did late last season, for that game, at some point there in the last month or so, they had a real struggle. It looked nothing. The stat sheet looked nothing like how it ended up in this game this time around. So I really have to say that he kind of just threw caution to the wind in the sense of going after them aggressively through the air, whether that was partly because of anticipating that he was going to need to do that to keep pace or not. To his credit, I mean, the easier or safer route, I think, is, you go out there and you hit them with mustard, a real heavy dose of them as much as possible. But instead, he said, look, my best weapons happen to be in the passing game. I don't really care what the stat sheet says and what the matchup sheets say. We're gonna try to make this work through the air, which is where our strength is, by and far, as far as on the offense.
Definitely. And that's another great point to the fact that when I started this segment, one of the first things I said was, I'm really not too interested if something is working if I don't agree with it. This is an exception to that rule that I've set for myself for years. And this is why I wanted to bring it up. And that's why I'm glad you brought up what you said as well. Once I tied in the McDaniel that we had been seeing in the preseason on I believe it was their 5th drive. It was a 12-play, 80-yard touchdown drive, about 5 minutes. And towards the end of that drive, more so towards the middle of that drive, and I remember this, watching this game, and when this happened, I can't remember who the announcers were, but it was 4th and 7, from the Chargers 42. And they're doing the math and saying, okay, that'd be a 59, 60-yarder for Sanders. Whoever the announcer was or the commentator was, say, obviously you can't punt right here, but my God, can you really go for this 4th and 7 at this point? And on the scoreboard at that moment before that drive, they were down 14-10. So you're down 4 points on the road. You're at the Chargers, your opponent's 42, and it's 4th and 7. And they line up for it, to go for it. And the announcer's basically saying in so many words, they're probably bluffing. They're probably going to try to draw them off sides. If that doesn't work, line up and maybe try to kick a 59-yarder, or maybe they will punt it. Nope, not bluffing. Tua, pass, short left to Smythe, pushed out of bounds at the Chargers 32, 10-yard pass play. And that goes back to what you said. It wasn't just aggression. It was creative 4th down aggression, the same thing we saw 100 times in the preseason. And I told a buddy of mine who's a huge Dolphins fan about a week ago, I said, I really think the Dolphins might be top 2 or 3 in the league in 4th down attempts this year. And I thought he was going to be excited and shocked. And he goes, yeah, so what? He goes, McDaniel's an aggressive guy. But remember when you and I look back and we saw last year, they were middle of the pack in 4th down attempts. So I think he was just assuming that they're aggressive, but the numbers said otherwise. But we saw different in the preseason. And these fools, and I'm saying fools in a good way because I love the Dolphins, born and raised down here in South Florida, and they go for it on a 4th and 7. You know how much pressure? I know you do, but I'm just telling everybody listening how much pressure that puts on the Chargers in that moment to say, wow, they just snapped the ball. Like, this is happening. And on top of that, the seed that plants and all the defensive players and the defensive coordinator, as well as the head coach, the rest of the way saying, what type of defensive packages do we need to have out there on some of these 4th downs? Because they're probably not bluffing. That really takes some leverage and power into your control the rest of the way. And you combine that with the pace, and like you said, the philosophy was working, that McDaniel didn't care about running the ball. The pass was working. He stuck with it. First quarter, 7 points for the Dolphins. Second quarter, 13. Third quarter, 7. Fourth quarter, 9. They finished that game with 36 points, and I will close with this. We're going to go right to the team stats right here. We know that Tua had 400 plus. Let's see what they had rushing yards. Miami Dolphins, overall, 536 total yards, 466 through the air, 70 on the ground. Threw the ball 45 times, only rushed it 20.
Right.
Now, I had a prop on Mostert, and I'm cool taking that loss. Like I always say, like you got to learn to take losses. But all I kept thinking was, man, this is working today. And I really felt this would work the whole way and get them to W. But I knew, in my opinion, I should say I know, this is not going to work all year. But this is why we take notes. This is why we study coaches at every point of the preseason. We're watching them in training camp. We're looking for philosophy. And now we're seeing unfolding in front of our eyes that not only are they playing the pace that McDaniel wants to play, but they're doing it his way, his philosophy, and they're executing on it successfully. And it worked. 36 points on the board on the road as, what were they, 2 3-point dogs? 3-point dogs. That right there is something that I want to get behind as early as possible. But in this case, from a team total over standpoint or a game total over standpoint, including the Chargers, because let's be honest, the Chargers put up 7-10, 7-10 in order to score their 34 points, and the pregame over-under was 50, and it landed on 70. But since we didn't really diagnose any of the pace or the philosophy for the Chargers, specifically closing it out for the Dolphins, they got positive grades on 2 out of the 3, pace and philosophy, and got a neutral grade on physicality. And the money was there for the taking from an in-game standpoint, just like it was for Dallas and San Francisco. So keep an eye on those 3 things to start every in-game handicap going forward the rest of the way, both pro and college. Positive or negative grades for pace, philosophy, and physicality. And once you get 2 out of 3, and it's not short-term, not just short-term, but it's long-term grades that you've seen the why of why they're getting a positive grade that will most likely last the full game. Once you get 2 out of 3, you're getting closer to that time when it should be the most opportune situation to place an in-game bet. And the only thing left to do at that standpoint is figure out, is it going to be on the spread or is it going to be on the team total over? And that's pretty much the gist of this deep dive. A little bit deeper than I wanted to, but as you guys know, I tend to ramble a little bit. But thank you, Juan, for jumping in multiple times to really point out the meat and potatoes of the value. And hopefully this is something that everybody listening can apply going forward for the rest of the year.
Yeah. No, that was awesome. And tell you what, in a little bit over 47 minutes of goodness here, you've given us 4 games. Really, we dove into 4 different scenarios that each had their own little nuances to them. So there's something to learn from each one of them. And that was great. That's a great start for the season in general for us, because this is kind of the same thing that we want to try to do as much as possible on each episode. And again, as we said, this season is going to give us, without a doubt, like all seasons really do, give us a lot of opportunities to talk about different scenarios that are going to pop up and a lot of strange things. It's so exciting to just know that we're just at the very beginning of the journey with 2023. So we're going to have plenty to look forward to. So yeah, with that, Eric, I mean, any final thoughts here at all as we turn our attention to week 2? Or do you think we kind of covered it for today?
You know what? I just got one quick one because it applies to the Niners in that game. Just one last little piece that I forgot to mention is the hype that the Steelers were getting going into that game for how good their offense looked in the preseason. Right. And I remember laughing to myself when they talked about that in the pregame. That was the national TV game on Fox. And I remember listening to the pregame saying, hey, everybody saw that the Steelers starters on offense dominated in the preseason. I think they scored all 5 of their drives. The starters did in the preseason. And I don't know if it was 3 touchdowns and 2 field goals or whatever it was, but they really put so much emphasis on the success that the Steelers had in the preseason. And I know you and I have been watching the NFL for many, many decades, not just years, many, many decades. And every time I've seen a team that was that dominant in the preseason when the games didn't count, I always learned to make sure to not give them too much credit for that. And I think the fans in the seats and the announcers and everybody but the 49ers was giving the Steelers a lot more credit than they should have been getting based on what they did when the games didn't count. And that's something that is important to have as a part of your handicap in a week one game like this, not only to diagnose the physicality on the San Francisco side and the fact that you know why that physicality is real and should apply the rest of the way, but also combining that with the extra value of knowing that the Steelers are currently overrated on offense based on what they did in the preseason. Just a little quick nugget to take with y'all.
Yeah, that's a really good one, especially for these week one, I guess you could say, really week one specific in particular, are a really good one to keep in mind because preseason is so fresh in everyone's minds. And whatever those teams have done, there's been nothing to disprove it yet at that point when week one kicks off. So that's a great point to make there to close it out. So with that, we'll turn our attention to week two. Obviously, by the time that you folks are hearing this, it's already kicked off with Vikings and Eagles on Thursday night. But we'll be back next time with a look at how everything played out on Sunday from an in-game handicapping perspective, and on Monday night potentially as well, and even on the Thursday night game if there was anything to take from that. So as always, we very much appreciate you listening. We'll ask you to please like and subscribe whatever platform you're enjoying this on so we can continue to build what we think is going to be the sharpest in-game handicapping community out there. So for my co-host, Eric Sherk, I'm Juan Carlos Blanco, and we'll catch you next time on Ingamified.